Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Lopez, and today we're going to discuss the crucial difference between the suffix skeptic and phobic. And so the difference seems pretty straightforward. Skeptic refers to the questioning, the doubting of a person or an idea or a thing, whereas phobic refers to fear towards that person, idea, or thing. However, the really intriguing question is, how are these suffixes used in mainstream media and with what ideological implications? Stay tuned.
So, skeptic versus phobic, ideological implications and alternatives. I have chosen to divide this presentation into three different parts. First, we'll have a look at the differences and ideological implications between these two suffixes, skeptic and phobic. Then we'll see some real examples from mainstream media, and I will propose a couple of thought experiments, and then I will present my conclusion and suggest alternatives. Now, first things first. What are the differences and ideological implications between these two suffixes? Now, in both cases, I'm going to distinguish between denotation and connotation. Now, the denotation is that for which the word stands, meaning the dictionary-like definition of it, whereas connotation has to do with the feelings and thoughts that people associate with it and its record throughout the centuries or years and the ideological implications contained in that word. So let's start with the suffix phobic on the left. Now, the denotation is having or involving an extreme or irrational fear of or aversion to something. So it can mean both fear or aversion. So in theory, at least, it can mean aversion without needing to imply fear. Now, when we go to the etymology of the suffix and we delve into its connotations, we'll see that phobia actually means an anxiety disorder defined by a persistent and excessive fear of an object or situation. So in the very definition of phobia, there is no mentioning aversion, even though the adjective phobic does feature aversion in its definition. So that semantic displacement there is very telling. And the implication, of course, is that we are conflating fear and aversion. When we use the adjective phobic in the media, we don't really know if that person experiences fear of or aversion to that which is deserving the labeling of whatever phobic, as in Islamophobic or homophobic, etc. Is that person feeling aversion to a homosexual person or to a Muslim, or is that person feeling fear, or both? Which one do you really mean? Well, what happens as a result of conflating both is that it seems to imply that if you have aversion to something, it is because you fear it. If you have aversion to Islam, it's because somehow you fear a part of the religion or the people who follow that religion, etc. So in practice, labeling somebody or something with the suffix phobic can be used as a shaming term meant to shut down the discussion. I'm not going to discuss your position against Islam because you're Islamophobic, and insofar as that phobia may or may not contain an element of irrational fear, I'm probably not discussing with a rational interlocutor, therefore I won't even take into consideration your position. Now let's go with the suffix skeptic. The denotation is that of questioning or doubting accepted opinions. The connotation is trickier because historically it has been linked to a school of thought in philosophy, which is skepticism. The skeptics in philosophy were people who denied the possibility of knowledge or even rational belief in some sphere, which is much more extreme than what the denotation points to, which is the mere questioning or doubting of accepted opinions. So, as a result of this decalage between the denotation and the connotation, the implication is that being skeptic of something, say for instance Euroskeptic, is to be negative about things, to doubt, to disbelieve them. And this can and is often misconstrued in mainstream media as implying an excessive form of questioning or even a soft form of negationism. And we know that negationism implies that you are negating the existence of that whose existence is evident. For instance, the concentration camps in World War II. We all know that they existed, so if you are negating their existence, you are a negationist. Now, if we apply that very strong label to political issues that, unlike the existence of concentration camps, are debatable, say for instance whether the European Union ought to be supported, now that's what might be implied when we label certain political agents EU skeptics. We might be implying that they are negating the existence of the European Union as something that is necessarily positive, which the position that labels the political interlocutor Eurosceptic is already assuming that the EU is good and that goodness cannot be questioned. And if you question that, it's because you might be as crazy as negationists are. You might be trapped into an unhealthy form of skepticism. So all in all, even though in principle skeptic does not sound as strong as phobic qua suffix, it can also be used to shame our political opponent's opinion in order to shut down discussion rather than foster public deliberation. So in that sense, both the suffix phobic and that of skeptic can be used for authoritarian purposes as opposed to democratic ones, because that which is contrary to public deliberation does not allow people to have a debate on issues on which they need to be informed in order to participate in democracy, in order to know what they're voting for or against. And now that we've discussed the denotation and connotation of the suffixes phobic and skeptic respectively, it is time for us to engage in a little thought experiment. I'm sure all of you have heard about anti-Semitism, which is to be against Judaism and or Jewish people, and also have heard about Islamophobia, right, which is the irrational fear of or aversion to Islam. Right, so you see an example of the use of the label anti-Semitism in mainstream media press. In this piece on The Guardian, anti-Semitism claims at the Royal Court Theatre and has to do with assumptions about Jews killing Christian children, etc., etc. And on the other hand, here we can also see an article, an opinion piece at The Guardian, where the term Islamophobia is on the headline. The alleged Buffalo shooter was also inspired by Islamophobia. Imagine now that instead of talking about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia respectively, mainstream media talked about Europhobia and anti-Islamism, thus replacing the anti-prefix with the phobia suffix in the case of opinions and claims against Jews and Judaism, and replacing the phobia suffix with the anti-prefix in the case of criticism of Islam and or Muslims. Judeophobia and anti-Islamism, these terms come across as odd. Why? Well, because they're nowhere near as popular as anti-Semitism and Islamophobia respectively, which begs the question, why so? What is the media trying to emphasize when they resort to anti-Semitism as opposed to Judeophobia? Can you not experience an irrational fear of Judaism and or Jewish people? The absence of the suffix phobia will seem to suggest that. Likewise, why are we not coming across the term anti-Islamism or anti-Islam as much as we're coming across the term Islamophobia? Can you not be against Islam unless you have an extreme irrational fear of or aversion to it? That's what seems to be implied. And in whose best interest is this? Well, it would seem as though criticism and skepticism vis-a-vis Jews and Judaism is fair play, according to mainstream media, whereas criticism and skepticism towards Islam is more of a taboo question, hence why people criticizing Islam is often labeled as Islamophobic, implying that irrational fear and or aversion, yes, but mostly fear, as we've seen apropos the connotation of the suffix phobic. Think about that for a second. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Now, a new thought experiment. Think about these terms: Euroskeptic versus Europhobic / Europhobe. Which one have you seen the most in the media? Euroskeptic or Europhobic / Europhobe? Well, I think the answer is pretty clear, but just in case, let me back it up with the actual numbers. As you can see on the screen, the word Euroskeptic on Google returns almost 2 million results, 1,770,000, whereas the adjective Europhobic barely returns over 15,000 results, and Google suggests that perhaps we meant euphoric rather than Europhobic, thus demonstrating the extent to which the adjective Europhobic is rare, particularly in comparison with Eurosceptic. And something similar happens with Europhobe, right? Europhobe returns 35,000 results, a bit better than Europhobic, but still it's a far cry from the almost 2 million results returned by Eurosceptic. So again, this asymmetry is very telling, and it begs the question, why is Eurosceptic between 50 and 100 times more used than Europhobic/Europhobe? Now let's pause at that for a second. In other words, the question we're trying to elucidate is why are Europe, which is a landmass, and the European Union, the EU, which is a political organization, a more flexible movement area, and an economic and monetary union, used interchangeably? In whose best interest is that conflation? Who benefits from the idea that just because one is critical of the EU, it necessarily means that that person is skeptical of and/or fears Europe at large? And the answer here is pretty clear. Pro-European Union politicians and organizations benefit from that conflation, benefit from this non sequitur. So that when, for instance, framing Brexiteers, proponents of Brexit, they can say every proponent of Brexit, or most of them anyway, is a Eurosceptic, meaning they want out of the European Union because they are over-doubting of the virtues of the European Union, even negationist about them. It cannot possibly be the case that they are legitimately skeptical of some of the many democratic shortcomings of the European Union and do not have any fear, aversion, or negationism vis-a-vis Europe. That seems to be the political implication. And so, in conclusion, what I want to do with these thought experiments and analysis of the suffixes phobic versus skeptic is to make you aware of the importance of linguistic self-determination. In other words, of the fact that the words you use have an effect on what you think and what your external reality looks like. It is therefore your ethical responsibility to curate those words in such a way that they mean what you say. You can find more information as to the way language is connected with thoughts and the world in the link that you can see now on top of the screen. Now that we're done with the analysis, what are the actionable alternatives that I suggest? Well, these are three. First, let's replace phobia with mysia. If hatred is really what we want to denounce, then the suffix mysia from the Greek word for hate or hatred of is much more appropriate. If we want to say that some people hate Islam, let's say Islamisia. Let's not say Islamophobia, because just because they hate it, it does not mean they fear it. And even if what you meant was aversion, because of the connotations of the word phobia, you've already conflated that aversion with fear, as I already denounced. Second, let's reclaim the suffix skeptic. The ability to question ideas is not only a possibility, but is actually a necessity for public deliberation, which is in turn a key aspect of democracy. We cannot have a democratic society unless we are not only allowed to, but actually encouraged to discuss ideas that can be legitimately criticized. And finally, number three, let us distinguish between the prefixes Euro and EU, respectively. Europe and the European Union are very different entities. Criticism of one need not entail criticism of the other, let alone hatred or fear of it.
So that's all from me. I hope this difference now is clear between skeptic and phobic and the way they're used in mainstream media with certain ideological implications. Please let me know what you think in the comments down below. And as always, thanks for watching.